Okay, let's get into it. We've got quite a stack of recent documents here, straight from the White House.
Yeah, we're looking at presidential proclamations, executive orders, and even a newly signed law.
And these aren't just, pieces of paper. These actions can really shift how the government works and potentially touch on parts of your life.
Mhm.
We're talking economy, science policy, even things like safety and dignity.
That's exactly right. And our goal here isn't just to read the headlines or the official statements. We want to dig into what these documents actually do.
Right. Who really benefits? Who might get hurt or burdened by these?
Yeah. And is it mostly symbolic, political theater? Or does
Oh.
it have real concrete effects? And how does it connect to big things like healthcare or the economy or just, well, individual well-being?
And crucially, we're sticking strictly to what's written in these documents. No outside info, just the text itself.
Exactly. So you're getting the analysis based purely on the source material we have in front of us.
Okay, so where should we start? How about with the proclamations? They often feel, well, the most traditional, maybe symbolic. We've got a few from May 2025.
Sounds good. Yeah, the Armed Forces Day 2025 proclamation from May 16th is a perfect example. It does the basic job, right? Declares the third Saturday of May is Armed Forces Day.
Honoring service members, their families, asking people to observe the day.
Exactly. Expressing appreciation, superseding the previous year's proclamation. That's its core ceremonial function.
But looking closely, it does mention some specific things beyond just the commemoration. It talks about ensuring the military is the world's most lethal fighting force.
It does, and it highlights bold steps taken for readiness. And here's specific detail that jumped out from the text. It claims that since November, enlistment numbers for every branch have surged.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it says recruitment is now the highest it has been in 30 years. So while it's mostly symbolic, it includes this very specific claim about military strength and recruitment success. Whether that claim holds up is another question, but it's right there in the text.
Okay, so for you listening at home, the direct effect is pretty minimal, right? It's symbolic recognition supporting the idea of military service. Underscores the dignity there.
Correct. And based just on this text, there's nothing suggesting a direct benefit for, say, wealthy individuals or specific defense contractors. It's about national recognition and nodding towards those military policy goals.
Okay, next up is the Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month 2025 proclamation, also dated May 16th. This seems to follow a similar pattern.
It does. It proclaims May as the month to celebrate the contributions of AAPI citizens throughout American history. Classic commemorative stuff.
Highlighting heritage contribution.
Resilience, yeah. And it uses specific people as examples. It mentions Lakshmi and Radhakrishnan Chilukuri and their daughter, who is Second Lady Usha Chilukuri. It also mentions Tulsi Gabbard, identified here as a director of national intelligence and a military veteran.
And it includes a data point, too.
It does. It notes that over 77,000 AAPI individuals serve in the armed forces. So again, a specific detail woven into the commemorative language.
So for AAPI communities, this is a symbol of recognition, supporting their dignity, acknowledging their history. And for everyone else, it encourages, understanding and appreciation.
Exactly. And like the Armed Forces Day 1, no direct benefit to wealthy individuals or specific businesses jumps out from the text. It's clearly a symbolic act aimed at recognizing a specific group's contributions.
Okay, but the Jewish American Heritage Month 2025 proclamation, also from May 16th, this one feels a bit different. It starts commemoratively proclaiming May, highlighting history.
Right. It talks about contributions since the founding. Quotes George Washington's famous letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, emphasizes the U.S. as a refuge.
But then it takes a sharp turn, right? It pivots to very current events.
It really does.
Yeah.
It explicitly contrasts those historical ideals with what it calls recent acts of anti-Semitism, particularly since October 7, 2023, and it gets very specific.
What kind of specific?
It mentions violence on college campuses and city streets, blood libels displayed proudly, and assaults on people wearing yarmulkes. These are direct quotes from the proclamation.
Wow, okay. That's very pointed language for a proclamation.
Extremely. And it uses these examples to frame the administration's position very clearly. It states a determination to confront anti-Semitism, including, it says, when it's disguised as anti-Zionism or Holocaust denialism.
And it makes some strong claims about the administration's stance, too.
Very strong. It claims the administration has never been a greater friend to the Jewish people. And crucially, it states the intent to use every appropriate legal tool to stop anti-Semitic assaults gripping our universities. It finishes by stating proud standing with Israel.
So for Jewish Americans listening, this goes way beyond just symbolic recognition. It's a direct acknowledgement of real safety concerns, and it promises government action, especially regarding universities.
Exactly. It speaks directly to dignity, safety, freedom from persecution in a very contemporary, very charged context.
And benefits for businesses or the wealthy.
Again, not mentioned directly in the text, but that specific mention of using legal tools on universities, that definitely adds a layer beyond just symbolism. It signals potential policy action, even if the proclamation itself doesn't spell out what those tools are or how they'd be used. It's symbolism carrying a heavy political message tied to current events.
Got it. Okay, the last proclamation here is National Maritime Day 2025, dated May 22nd. This one honors the U.S. merchant marine and mariners.
Right, back to recognizing a specific profession and industry. It highlights their history, mentioning the SS Savannah and their crucial roles in both national defense, delivering troops and supplies, especially sacrifices in World War II, and also in economic strength today.
Transporting goods, supporting shipping, shipbuilding, logistics, energy.
Exactly, all those critical industries. It emphasizes their vital role.
What's interesting here, though, is it explicitly links this recognition to recent policy.
It does. It specifically mentioned signing an executive order just last month, in April 2025, titled Restoring America's Maritime Dominance. And it says that EO was aimed at spurring investment in shipbuilding, eliminating regulations, and expanding training.
So it's using the symbolic day to reinforce a concrete policy push.
Precisely. For you, the listener, the proclamation itself is mostly symbolic recognition, acknowledging the importance and dignity of this workforce. The mention of supply chains hints at how it affects everyone, through the economy, but it doesn't detail the effects of that April EO, just its goals.
But unlike the others, this one points directly to potential benefits for a specific business sector.
That's right. Mentioning an EO focused on spurring investment and eliminating regulations clearly signals potential benefits for businesses in the maritime sector, shipbuilding, shipping lines, logistics companies, and so on.
So it's symbolic recognition, but also a clear plug for recent policy actions designed to help that industry.
Exactly. So these proclamations, you see, they start as symbolic acts, recognizing dignity, heritage, service, but they can really vary. Some are purely commemorative, others weave in strong political statements, react to current events, or even directly promote specific policy actions and potential benefits for certain industries.
That's a great summary. Okay, let's pivot now. From these largely symbolic actions, let's look at something with immediate binding legal force, a newly signed law.
Okay, we have an announcement here stating President Donald J. Trump signed S-146 into law, and it's known as the Take It Down Act.
Right, and the key difference here is this isn't just the president acting alone through an ERO or proclamation. This is a law passed by Congress.
That's crucial. It went through the whole legislative process, House, Senate, and then was signed by the president, so it's now part of federal statute. What we have here is just the announcement of that final step.
Okay, and according to this announcement, what does the Take It Down Act actually do?
The text is pretty clear. It establishes a criminal prohibition on the intentional disclosure of non-consensual intimate visual depictions.
So, addressing what's often called revenge porn.
Exactly. And critically, the announcement also states the law requires covered platforms to remove such depictions.
Okay, that sounds like a very direct response to a specific online harm. How does this affect you, the listener?
This has a very direct, concrete effect. It creates a new federal crime that gives victims a legal pathway and imposes criminal penalties on people who share intimate images without consent. And maybe just as importantly, it puts a legal obligation on what it calls covered platforms.
Which likely means social media sites, hosting providers.
Probably, yes,
Right.
those kinds of entities. It requires them to have procedures to take down this content when they're notified. So this directly impacts individual dignity, safety, and privacy online. It's meant to provide real protection.
And are there benefits for businesses mentioned here?
Well, the text points to a requirement for these covered platforms. They have to implement removal processes. That means costs developing systems, hiring reviewers, potential legal risks if they mess up. So for those businesses, it's clearly a new regulatory burden, a cost of doing business, not a direct benefit.
So unlike the proclamations, this is definitely a concrete legal action, not symbolic, not political theater in the main. It's addressing a specific harm with clear legal requirements, clear consequences, aiming directly at protecting individual safety and dignity online.
Exactly. A legislative action with mandated effects and responsibilities.
All right, let's move into the executive orders now. These are directives from the president to the agencies in the executive branch. We've got several here covering some pretty diverse and complex areas. First up, trade, tariffs, and China.
Okay, we have the executive order modifying reciprocal tariff rates to reflect discussions with the People's Republic of China. This was dated May 12, 2025. And right away, it cites some heavy-hitting legal authority, i.e. EPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the National Emergencies Act, the Trade Act of 1974.
And it refers back to earlier actions, right? A national emergency declaration.
Yes, it refers to prior EOs 14257, 14259, 14266 that declared a national emergency based on large and persistent annual U.S. goods trade deficits with the PRC. The administration had framed those deficits as a threat to national security and the economy.
And those earlier EOs were about imposing tariffs on Chinese goods.
Right. They imposed and then increased additional tariffs. That's the background. This new EO says that since the last one, the U.S. has entered into discussions with the PRC, and it claims the PRC has taken a significant step towards remedying non-reciprocal trade arrangements.
Okay, so based on that claim of progress and talks, this EO changes the tariffs again. But how?
It directs a modification. Specifically, it suspends 24 percentage points of the additional duty that was previously imposed. But here's the key part. It does this only for a period of 90 days.
90 days, that's not long.
Not at all. This suspension results in a temporary additional duty rate of 10% on covered articles imported from the PRC, including Hong Kong and Macau. This took effect May 14th, 2025. So it's a reduction, but explicitly temporary.
What about those low-value imports that have been in the news?
It addresses those too, specifically mentioning goods related to synthetic opioids. For certain low-value imports of these goods, it decreases the ad valorem rate, that's the percentage-based tariff, from 120% down to 54%. However, it keeps a specific per-item duty of $100 on those same goods. So a mixed change there, also effective May 14th. And then it directs the relevant agencies, Commerce, Homeland Security, USTR, etc., to implement all this. And it has that standard disclaimer that the order doesn't create legally enforceable rights.
Okay, let's unpack the effect on you, the listener. How do tariffs usually impact regular Americans?
Well, tariffs are basically taxes on imported stuff. So they can increase the price you pay for goods that come from other countries, or goods made with imported parts. How much depends on whether businesses absorb the cost or pass it on.
So this reduction in the tariff rate, even though it's just temporary, could it mean lower prices?
It could. A temporary cut from, well, the EO implies it was 34% down to 10% for 90 days.
Yeah.
That might lead to slightly lower prices on some things you buy that come from China for those 3 months. Same for the change on low-value imports if you buy cheap items directly online. But honestly, predicting the exact impact on your wallet just from this text is tough. It depends on the specific products and how businesses react.
Right. And who benefits most directly from this, especially businesses?
Businesses that import goods from China definitely benefit from the lower tariff rate, even for just 90 days. It cuts their costs. So think retailers, manufacturers using Chinese components. Businesses doing direct-to-consumer low-value sales also see that rate cut. But that 90-day limit, that creates a lot of uncertainty for businesses trying to plan ahead.
So is this mostly symbolic political theater, or is there more substance?
Well, the EO very explicitly frames this tariff change as happening because of discussions with the PRC and because the PRC supposedly took significant steps. That framing strongly suggests the tariffs are being used as a bargaining chip in ongoing trade negotiations.
Like a carrot, maybe? A temporary one?
Exactly. The 90-day temporary nature really reinforces that view. It looks less like a permanent policy change and more like a tactical move. Show us more progress in the next 90 days or maybe the tariffs go back up. The language about the national emergency and trade deficits also keeps that political pressure on.
Okay, so the order presents this reduction as a direct result of positive talks. Is there potentially deceptive wording there?
Well, the order claims that discussions and PRC actions are a significant step toward fixing things. Whether that's an accurate assessment of the situation or just the administration's spin to justify a tactical move. You can't tell just from this EO's text. But that very short 90-day window, it definitely makes you question the substance or permanence of that significant step. The language presents a very specific narrative.
And constitutionality, based just on the text.
It cites its authority under IEEPA, the National Emergencies Act, the Trade Act. These are broad powers Congress has given the president for national security and trade issues. Using IEPA, based on a declared national emergency in this case, trade deficits framed as a national security threat grants really significant authority. Directing agencies on tariffs is within that power. So, based only on the text, there's no glaring red flag of unconstitutionality, though the use of IEPA for broad economic issues is something that gets debated generally.
So, this tariff EO is basically a move in the ongoing trade chess game with China. Offers some temporary relief, maybe, potentially for importers and consumers, but it's framed politically and seems designed as leverage for negotiations.
That sums it up well. A complex tactical move within a larger strategy.
Okay, let's switch gears dramatically now. We're moving from trade to energy policy and national security, specifically looking at a cluster of 4 executive orders, all issued on the very same day, May 23rd, 2025. Looks at a major push on nuclear energy.
Absolutely. These 4 EOs, you can tell they were designed to work together. They all share this overarching goal: rapidly expand U.S. nuclear energy, modernize the regulations, strengthen the domestic industry, and they constantly link this to national security, energy independence, and economic dominance.
Okay, let's tackle them one by one. First, the executive order deploying advanced nuclear reactor technologies for national security.
Right off the bat, this one declares a critical national security imperative. What is it? Ensuring resilient, secure, reliable energy for critical defense facilities. And it specifically calls out things like AI capabilities and other mission resources that are vulnerable to energy disruption.
And it sees advanced nuclear reactors as the answer.
It does. It identifies things like Generation 3 plus small modular reactors, SMRs, microreactors. Says they could provide this reliable power. But it notes they haven't been deployed fast enough or at the scale needed, while claiming adversaries are rapidly exporting and deploying such technology.
So it's framed immediately as a national security issue and a race against competitors. What are the main policy goals stated here?
The EO lays out several. Rapid development and deployment of this advanced nuclear tech, specifically for national security. Enabling private investment by using federal resources, things like government-owned uranium, plutonium, R&D facilities. Coordinating the regulatory side between the Department of Defense, DoD, and Department of Energy, DOE. And a big one: boosting U.S. exports of this tech to allies, explicitly aiming to unleash the domestic nuclear industrial base.
Okay, those are big goals. What specific actions does it order agencies to take?
There are quite a few concrete directives, often with specific deadlines attached. The Secretary of Defense, working through the Army, has to set up a program to use nuclear energy at military installations. The target: operate a nuclear reactor at a domestic military base by September 30th, 2028.
A nuclear reactor on a U.S. military base by 2028. That's ambitious.
Very. The Secretary of Energy is supposed to provide technical advice, and within 240 days, DoD has to send recommendations for any new laws or regulations needed for reactors and spent fuel on military bases. DOE is also told to designate AI data centers at or working with DOE facilities as critical defense facilities where appropriate, making their power supply defense-critical electric infrastructure.
So nuclear power for military bases and maybe for AI centers at DOE labs. Very specific linkage.
Extremely specific. Energy is also directed to pick 1 or more sites for advanced nuclear deployment within 90 days and, importantly, use all its legal powers to cite, approve, and authorize privately funded advanced reactors at DOE sites.
Privately funded reactors on government land.
Yes, powering things the EO identifies as critical needs, like AI, supply chains, or just on-site infrastructure.
Yeah.
And the goal for the first of these privately funded reactors at a DOE site is to be operational within 30 months.
30 months. That sounds incredibly fast for any nuclear project. What about the fuel? Advanced reactors often need special fuel.
That's a huge piece of this IO. Energy has 60 days to survey available nuclear material for fuel. And here's a massive directive. Energy is told to release at least 20 metric tons of HALEU, that's high-assay low-enriched uranium, specifically for these private projects at DOE sites, powering AI and infrastructure.
HALEU is that specialized fuel, right? Hard to get right now domestically.
Exactly. Supply is very limited. The EKO says the government should provide this HALEU while making sure enough is kept for weapons, naval reactors, and tritium needs by drawing from other government stockpiles. It also directs planning for a long-term domestic supply chain for enriched uranium. And DoD and Energy are told to use their authority to site and approve privately funded facilities for fuel recycling, reprocessing, and fabrication on their sites.
Wow. So the government is basically offering up its land, its infrastructure, and its strategic nuclear material to fuel private advanced reactor development.
That's what the text directs. And then there's the huge push on exports. The Secretary of State is ordered to lead diplomatic efforts to get more nuclear export agreements called 123 agreements. The target is aggressive. Pursue at least 20 new agreements and renegotiate expiring ones, using federal resources to promote U.S. industry globally. Energy is also told to speed up export authorization requests, review them within 30 days.
A full government push to sell U.S. nuclear tech abroad.
Yes, and OSTP and the President's economic advisor have 90 days to figure out a strategy to use U.S. development finance agencies, DFC, TDA, Exim Bank, plus multilateral development banks to support these exports with loans, grants, trade missions, high-level lobbying, the works.
Okay, I also saw something about environmental reviews. NEPA, how does that fit in?
It's definitely in there. DoD and Energy are told to consult with the Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ, on how to comply with NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. But the EO specifically lists ways to streamline it, using existing categorical exclusions, adopting exclusions from other agencies, creating new ones, using emergency procedures, or developing alternative arrangements in emergencies. It's a clear signal they want to speed up or potentially bypass standard environmental reviews for these projects.
And security clearances.
Also mentioned, DoD is told to prioritize security clearances, listing all the types, L, Q, secret, top secret, etc., to help get nuclear tech and material distributed and used faster.
Okay, let's pull this EO together. What are the potential effects on you, the regular American?
Well, potential positives could include better energy security for critical defense and DOE sites, which supports national security. It could create jobs in the nuclear sector and related industries. Long-term, maybe it impacts the energy mix, but it's not clear if power generated at these specific federal sites would directly benefit your home electricity bill.
And the potential downsides or questions.
Big questions about environmental impact, especially with the push to streamline NEPA. How will spent fuel be managed? What about safety with these very accelerated timelines? And then there are the national security implications of aggressively exporting sensitive nuclear technology, though the EO does say they'll adhere to non-proliferation rules and safety standards. So it's a mix. Potential benefits for security and jobs, but real questions about environmental protection and safety, given the speed and streamlined processes being pushed.
And who are the clear winners here, especially among businesses?
This EO looks like a massive potential boon for the advanced nuclear reactor industry and the whole nuclear supply chain. It's explicitly designed, it says, to enable private sector investment, unleash the domestic nuclear industrial base, and make U.S. companies the partners of choice globally.
So reactor designers, fuel companies, AI firms needing power, construction.
All of them. They stand to gain from access to federal land, federal resources like HA-Lee fuel, prioritize government support for exports, faster security clearances, and potentially much quicker environmental reviews. It's heavily weighted towards supporting and promoting the nuclear industry.
How much of this feels symbolic versus concrete action? Is it political theater?
There's definitely strong political framing. Language like critical national security imperative, American technological superiority, countering adversaries, that sets a political tone. And the specific deadlines, SEP 2028 for the military reactor, 30 months for the first DOE site reactor, 20 new export deals.
Right.
Those are concrete targets, yes, but they also function as political goals to show progress. And pushing to streamline NEPA is often a political objective itself, so it's concrete directives wrapped in very strong political rhetoric.
Any wording that strikes you as potentially deceptive, based
Right.
only on the text?
Well, the EO confidently asserts that advanced nuclear can provide resilient, secure, and reliable power and boost American technological superiority. These are presented almost as guarantees, claims about the technology's potential and the policy's intended outcome. But whether these actions will actually achieve all that safely and on those super-fast timelines, the text doesn't prove that. It just directs the actions aimed at it. It states an intention to maintain high standards, but doesn't detail how that squares with the aggressive speed. And presenting NEPA streamlining as just necessary for speed could be seen as downplaying potential environmental risks, even with the mention of consulting CEQ.
And constitutionality, just based on the text, any red flags?
It cites the president's authority under the Constitution and laws like IEPA and the Atomic Energy Act. Directing DoD and DOE is standard presidential stuff. Using those specific laws provides the claimed legal basis. Now, whether pushing NEPA streamlining to the limit or directing federal resources like HAVU this way stays perfectly within all statutory boundaries might be tested later, but on its face, the EO claims legal authority for its actions.
Okay, so this first nuclear EO really sets the stage. National security rationale, specific DOE actions, aggressive timelines, providing federal fuel and resources, boosting exports, and streamlining environmental reviews.
Exactly. Now, let's look at the next one from that same day. Executive order ordering the reform of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. This one goes right after the main regulator, the NRC.
And it starts with some really strong language criticizing the NRC, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. It declares abundant energy, vital for national and economic security, linking nuclear, along with fossil fuels, to freedom from dependence on rivals and powering future industries like AI and quantum computing. Then it hits the NRC hard. It says the NRC has licensed only a fraction of reactors since 1978. It claims the NRC's fee structure and long timelines maximize fees while throttling nuclear power development.
It claims the NRC basically failed to license new tech.
Yes, despite promises of safety and cost benefits. And it claims the NRC's fundamental errors, insulating from remote risks without considering the severe domestic and geopolitical costs of not having that power.
And this is where it gets into the science behind the regulations, right? Makes some really specific claims.
This is probably the most controversial part, scientifically. The EO claims the NRC relies on radiation models, specifically the linear no threshold, or LNT model, and the as low as reasonably achievable, or LRRA standard, which it says is based on LNT. And then the EO flat out asserts these models lack sound scientific basis and produce irrational results.
Irrational how?
It gives the example of requiring protection against radiation levels below naturally occurring background levels. It argues that focusing on minimizing these supposedly trivial risks ignores bigger risks, like pollution from other energy sources, citing European blackouts as proof we need reliable power like nuclear.
Wow. Directly challenging the scientific foundation of radiation safety regulations in an executive order, that's a huge deal. So after criticizing the NRC so heavily, what are the stated goals for reform?
The goals are massive. Reestablish the United States as the global leader. Facilitate increased deployment by lowering regulatory and cost barriers. Here's a huge number. Expand nuclear capacity from approximately 100 gigalivu in 2024 to 400 gigalardu by 2050.
Quadrupling capacity by 2050. That's enormous.
It is. It also aims to use new tech to speed up design approvals, support existing plants, even reactivate closed or partially built ones, while, and this is stated, maintain the United States' leading reputation for nuclear safety.
Okay, achieving that massive expansion while maintaining a leading safety reputation. How does the EO say the NRC should do that? What specific actions are mandated?
It orders a wholesale revision of NRC regulations and guidance. It demands a reform of the NRC's culture, telling it to include facilitating nuclear power and considering economic and national security factors right alongside safety, health, and the environment.
Changing the culture of an independent regulator by EO.
That's what it directs. It orders a reorganization of NRC structure and staffing, even consulting with a DOE team Department of Government Efficiency to promote expeditious processing. It explicitly mentions undertaking reductions in force, though it admits new licensing might need some staff increases, and it mandates creating a dedicated team of at least 20 officials just to draft these new regulations.
So direct intervention in staffing, structure, culture. What else?
It orders cuts to the personnel and functions of the Advisory Committee on Reactor Safeguards, ACRS, reducing it to minimum statutory needs and telling it to focus only on truly novel safety issues.
The ACRS is supposed to be the independent technical safety check, right?
Traditionally, yes. The ODO also sets aggressive timelines for the regulatory overhaul, proposed rules within 9 months, final rules within 18 months.
18 months for a wholesale revision of complex nuclear regulations. And what about the licensing process itself? How's that changed?
This is key. The EO mandates fixed deadlines for the NRC to approve licenses, amendments, renewals, etc. And these deadlines are to be enforced by fixed caps on the hourly fees the NRC charges applicants.
Fixed deadlines and capped fees. What are the deadlines?
Maximum of 2 years for a new reactor construction and operation license application from start to finish. Maximum of 1 year for renewing an existing reactor's operating license. And the EO stresses these deadlines should not be told, unless the applicant fails to provide info, and that a reasonably diligent applicant must be able to succeed within that time frame. It even tells the NRC to adopt shorter deadlines if possible.
Setting strict, short deadlines like that really seems designed to force faster decisions, potentially faster approvals. And what about those science standards it criticized?
It orders the NRC to adopt science-based radiation limits, and it explicitly tells the NRC to reconsider reliance on the LNT model and the LRR standard, calling them flawed. It suggests considering determinate radiation limits instead and consulting DoD, DOE, and EPA on this fundamental shift. It also tells the NRC to revise its NEPA compliance rules to match recent amendments and policies from a prior EO focused on energy.
So it's not just about speed, it's ordering a potential change to the core science of radiation safety and environmental review at the NRC.
Exactly. It also mandates creating an expedited pathway for reactor designs already tested by DOE, telling the NRC to only review risks from the new aspects of the application, not revisit things already deemed safe by DOE. It orders a process for high-volume licensing of microreactors and modular reactors, think standardized applications, maybe even general licenses. And it wants stringent thresholds before the NRC can demand design changes once construction is already underway.
Less scrutiny, more standardization, less flexibility for regulators once things get going.
That seems to be the direction. Finally, it directs revising the reactor oversight process and security rules to cut unnecessary burdens and focus only on credible, realistic risks. It suggests reconsidering how long renewed licenses last, maybe extending them based on data, and it wants the public hearings process streamlined.
Okay, let's try to synthesize this massive NRC reform EO. What are the potential effects on you, the regular American?
The potential effects are really significant, and they cut both ways. On one hand, the goal is much faster deployment of nuclear power. If that happens, it could boost energy supply, maybe help with reliability, potentially lower long-term energy costs if that 400 gigawatt target is reached. And it could create jobs.
But the on the other hand seems pretty big here.
It is. The incredibly aggressive timelines, the major streamlining of regulations, cutting back the role of the independent safety advisors, ACRS, and especially that fundamental challenge to the established radiation safety models, L and TALARA. All of that raises huge questions about the potential impact on safety and environmental protection. The Elmore basically argues current rules are too cautious about trivial risks. If that leads to policies allowing higher radiation exposure, that's a major concern for public health and safety, despite the stated goal of maintaining a leading safety reputation. So it heavily impacts potential safety, environment, jobs, and maybe energy cost reliability down the line.
Who benefits most clearly from this overhaul of the regulator?
This EO looks like a potential jackpot for the nuclear power industry, dramatically cutting regulatory burdens, forcing faster licensing with capped fees, prioritizing specific reactor types, streamlining environmental and design reviews. All these things directly lower costs, speed up projects, and reduce barriers for companies wanting to build and operate nuclear plants. It's a huge boost aimed directly at the sector by changing the rules of the game.
How much symbolism or political theater is involved here?
The language is intensely political. It paints the NRC as this bureaucratic obstacle, throttling, failed to license, fundamental error, overregulated complacency. That's strong rhetoric to justify the reforms. The 400 gigawatt target by 2050 and those strict regulatory deadlines are ambitious political goals. And attacking specific scientific models like Ellen Talara is a very deliberate policy choice with big political undertones, aligning with certain views on risk and regulation. So it's concrete directives wrapped in very forceful political framing.
And potentially deceptive wording, based just on the text.
Well, the assertion that the NRC's current scientific models, L and Talara, lack sound scientific basis and produce irrational results, that's presented as fact in the EO. But it's a highly contested scientific claim. LNT and LOR are widely used internationally for radiation protection. The EO promotes an alternative, determinate radiation limits, without really explaining why it's scientifically better in the text beyond criticizing the current models. Also, the claim that these reforms can both maintain leading safety standards and dramatically speed things up, that presents potentially conflicting goals as achievable simultaneously, without detailing the potential trade-offs. And again, claiming tens of thousands of high-paying jobs is a prediction, not a guaranteed outcome of the order itself.
What about potential constitutionality issues?
It cites the president's authority and laws, including NRC's own mandate for efficiency. Directing agencies is generally okay, but telling an independent regulatory commission like the NRC exactly how to interpret science, mandating specific fixed deadlines for their independent judgments, or significantly altering their structure and advisory bodies, that could face legal challenges. Critics might argue it interferes too much with the NRC's statutory independence and its primary mission of ensuring safety, even if efficiency is also a goal.
So this NRC Reform EO is a really aggressive, direct attempt to reshape how nuclear power is regulated in the U.S. It's driven by a viewpoint that current rules are too slow and too cautious. Big potential upside for the industry, but big questions for the public about safety and environmental standards in this push for speed and expansion.
Okay, let's move to the third nuclear EO from May 23rd. Reforming nuclear reactor testing at the Department of Energy. This one seems laser-focused on the testing and demonstration part.
Right. It starts with similar themes U.S. used to lead. Fell behind due to overregulated complacency. Other nations are moving faster. It links nuclear to the energy emergency and talks up the promise of advanced reactors for new uses like data centers, chip making, even desalination and hydrogen production. The policy: foster innovation, get advanced tech into production ASAP.
And here's where it makes a really key legal argument. The EO asserts that when DOE builds and tests advanced reactors specifically not for commercial electricity sales, that activity qualifies as research purposes.
Research purposes. Why is that distinction important?
Because, according to the EO, this places those activities under DOE's jurisdiction, using its R&D authority from the Atomic Energy Act. The EO claims this means they don't fall under the standard NRC commercial licensing process, which is governed by a different law, 42 U.S.C. 58842. It explicitly states this interpretation applies, at least for the foreseeable future.
Okay, so it looks like it's trying to use DOE's research authority as a pathway to potentially bypass or significantly change the usual NRC commercial licensing route, at least for the initial testing phase of these new reactors.
That's certainly the argument laid out in the text. Based on that premise, it mandates specific actions. Within 60 days, Energy has to issue guidance defining a qualified test reactor, basically one that's feasible to operate within 2 years of applying, with solid technical and financial backing.
2 years from application to operation for a test reactor.
Yes, and within 90 days, Energy has to revise its own regulations and procedures for its national labs and other sites to significantly expedite the review, approval, and deployment of these advanced reactors under DOE's jurisdiction. The explicit goal is to get these qualified test reactors operational at DOE sites within 2 years of receiving a substantially complete application.
Again, incredibly fast timelines.
Extremely. And it directs that once DOE gets a substantially complete application for one of these test reactors, the Energy Secretary has to set up a dedicated team reporting directly to the Secretary, specifically to help the applicant push it through expeditiously.
What about projects outside the big national labs? Is there anything for them?
Yes, there's a pilot program mentioned. The EO tells the Energy Secretary to create a pilot for reactor construction and operation outside the labs, but still under DOE's sufficient control. The example given is projects under contract with and for the account of DOE, again citing that Atomic Energy Act R&D authority.
And the goal for this pilot?
Approve at least 3 reactors under this pilot program, with the aim of achieving criticality, basically, turning them on by a very specific date. July 4th, 2026.
July 4th, 2026. That date definitely sounds chosen for its symbolism, tying this tech goal to a national anniversary.
It certainly seems that way. This EO, like the others, also includes directives to streamline environmental reviews, NEPA, under DOE's authority, setting a deadline of June 30, 2025. It tells DOE to use all available tools to speed up NEPA and permits figuring out what's not subject to NEPA, creating or using categorical exclusions, using existing site analyses, or using those alternative procedures under NEPA that were mentioned in the other EO.
Okay, so what are the potential effects on you, the regular American, from this specific testing-focused EO?
Well, potential positives include job creation, specifically in nuclear R&D, technology development, maybe some specialized construction. It could definitely speed up the advancement of nuclear technology, which might lead to new energy options down the road.
But the focus is just on testing sites, right?
Right, so the direct impact on your home electricity supply might be less immediate compared to deploying commercial plants everywhere. The main questions here revolve around safety and oversight. Using DOE's research authority might mean less public visibility and potentially different safety review processes compared to the standard NRC commercial licensing route, which usually involves more public hearings and input, though the NRC reform EO targets those too. So it impacts jobs and tech, but raises questions about safety, oversight, transparency, and public participation under this accelerated DOE process.
And who benefits here? Which businesses?
This EO seems tailor-made to benefit companies developing new advanced nuclear reactor designs. It gives them access to federal sites and infrastructure for testing. It creates what looks like a potentially faster, dedicated pathway to get their designs built and running, possibly sidestepping or significantly altering the standard NRC process, at least initially. That pilot program explicitly aims to approve privately funded reactors operating under DOE contracts. This lowers hurdles, speeds up R&D, and provides significant federal support for the nuclear tech industry to demonstrate their concepts.
Symbolism or political theater?
The framing about overcoming complacency and catching up to foreign rivals is strong political rhetoric, and that July 4, 2026 target date for the pilot reactors is clearly a political milestone, linking the technical goal to national pride. Using the research classification under DOE authority, that could definitely be seen as a strategic legal and political maneuver to speed things up, presented as necessary for global competitiveness.
Any potentially deceptive wording based just on the text?
The key element that might be seen that way is classifying this advanced reactor testing under DOE's R&D authority as research, even for projects described as privately funded and feasibly operational within 2 years. That sounds very close to commercial demonstration. The EO says this applies at least for the foreseeable future. Critics could argue this classification is a legal interpretation designed to avoid the potentially more rigorous safety reviews and public scrutiny of the NRC commercial licensing process. The EO says safety standards will be met, but doesn't detail how that's ensured under this expedited DOE process compared to the NRC's methods.
And constitutionality concerns?
It cites the president's authority and laws, specifically DOE's R&D role under the Atomic Energy Act. The core issue would be that legal interpretation. Is classifying this near-commercial testing as research under DOE's authority rather than commercial activity under NRC's consistent with the law? That distinction could be challenged based on existing statutes and legal precedents about which agency has jurisdiction over what kind of nuclear activity.
Okay, so this EO focuses specifically on accelerating the testing and demonstration part of advanced nuclear, using DOE authority and potentially different regulatory pathways, all framed as vital for speed and global leadership.
Exactly. Now for the final piece of this May 23rd nuclear puzzle, the executive order reinvigorating the nuclear industrial base. This one seems to zoom out and look at the whole ecosystem.
Right. It starts by listing challenges, the AI race, energy independence, needing uninterruptible power for national security. And it criticizes the U.S. again for slow nuclear growth compared to others, foreign dominance in recent reactor designs, and points specifically to the severe atrophy of the U.S. nuclear fuel cycle infrastructure.
Yes, highlighting that reliance on foreign sources for uranium, enrichment, conversion, a major supply chain vulnerability. So the stated policy here is broad, to expedite and promote to the fullest possible extent the production and operation of nuclear energy, both existing plants and new advanced reactors. And a huge focus is on building the associated supply chains needed for global industrial and digital dominance, energy independence, security, plus maximizing fuel efficiency through recycling and reprocessing.
So self-sufficiency, global competitiveness, covering everything from fuel to reactors. What specific actions does it order?
A lot. It covers the entire fuel cycle. Within 240 days, the Energy Secretary, working with DoD, Transportation, OMB, has to report to the President on a national policy for spent fuel and waste management and developing an advanced fuel cycle for the long term. This includes looking at needed legislative changes, evaluating reprocessing and recycling of government spent fuel from DoD, analyzing the idea of transferring spent fuel to a government-owned, privately operated reprocessing facility.
Reprocessing is a big deal, environmentally and politically.
Huge. The report should also recommend how to use recovered materials, like uranium, plutonium, efficiently, how to dispose of wastes, how to reuse old facilities, and how to safely transport advanced fuels and reactors. It's tasking them with rethinking the entire back end of the fuel cycle with a clear push towards reprocessing.
And there's something about surplus plutonium, too.
Yes, a major policy shift. The EO directs the Energy Secretary to halt the current program of diluting and disposing of surplus plutonium, with an exception for existing obligations to South Carolina. Instead, it orders the establishment of a program to dispose of surplus plutonium by processing it and making it available to industry as fuel for advanced nuclear technologies.
Wow. Taking weapons-grade material meant for disposal and potentially turning it into commercial reactor fuel, that's significant.
Extremely. The EO also requires updating policies on managing excess uranium within 90 days, and it directs prioritizing contracts for fuel fabrication facilities that can feasibly supply fuel to those test reactors and pilot program reactors from the other EO within 3 years of applying.
How does the government plan to actually support the industry financially, get these supply chains built?
Through some powerful tools. Within 30 days, Energy, working with the Attorney General and FTC chair, is told to use the Defense Production Act, DPA authority, to seek voluntary agreements with domestic nuclear companies.
The DPA, that's usually for wartime or major emergencies.
Right. It allows the government to compel industry action for national security. Here it's to be used for cooperative procurement of nuclear fuel, LEU and HALEU. And energy is authorized to provide support, like procurement contracts, forward contracts, or financial guarantees to industry consortia formed under these DPA agreements, specifically to guarantee buyers offtake for newly established domestic fuel supply chains.
So using the DPA and providing financial backstops to build domestic fuel production.
Exactly. On the reactor side, energy is told to prioritize work with industry to get 5 gigawatts of power uprates done at existing reactors, and to get complete applications submitted for 10 new large reactors. The DOE Loan Programs Office is explicitly directed to prioritize nuclear projects across the board, restarting closed plants, boosting output at existing ones, finishing incomplete ones, building new advanced reactors, and supporting the fuel supply chain projects needed for all that.
So federal loan money is being steered heavily towards nuclear.
Very clearly. Energy is also told to look into restarting or repurposing closed nuclear plants as energy hubs, potentially to support military microgrids. And within 180 days, Energy, working with the Small Business Administration, is to prioritize funding grants, loans, investments for qualified advanced nuclear tech companies, focusing on those with mature tech, financial backing, and near-term potential.
It seems to cover everything. What about the people needed to actually do all this work?
Workforce development is a major component. Nuclear engineering and related jobs are designated priority areas under a previous EO. Within 120 days, the Labor and Education Secretaries are directed to boost participation in nuclear apprenticeships and career and technical education (CTE) programs. This involves using discretionary funds, encouraging states to use federal workforce funds (WIOA), making nuclear careers a priority for grants. Other agencies giving educational grants are also told to prioritize nuclear careers, and energy is directed to increase access for college students and DoD personnel to DOE national lab facilities, staff, and expertise.
Okay, this EO is incredibly comprehensive. Fuel, financing, construction, workforce. What are the potential effects on you, the regular American?
Well, the explicit goal is significant job creation across the whole nuclear sector: mining, fuel processing, building plants, operating them, R&D, training. If the capacity targets are met, it could impact energy reliability and maybe costs in the long run. But there are huge environmental implications, especially with the push for reprocessing and the new policy on surplus plutonium. The workforce focus could create good educational and career paths. So it hits jobs, environment, education, careers, and potentially energy reliability and cost.
Who are the clear beneficiaries here? Businesses.
This looks like a massive support package for essentially every part of the nuclear industrial base. Uranium miners, fuel fabricators, reprocessing hopefuls, reactor designers, manufacturers, construction firms, plant operators, service companies, they all stand to benefit. Prioritize federal funding, loan guarantees, procurement support. Those DPA agreements facilitated collaboration, access to federal resources and expertise, even getting surplus plutonium as potential fuel. It's a substantial set of incentives and support directed squarely at the industry.
Symbolism or political theater?
It's again strong rhetoric, energy dominance, global industrial and digital dominance, secure and independent energy future. Framing it as reversing foreign dominance and using the DPA signals national security urgency. But the detailed plans for funding, supply chains, workforce, that's concrete government intervention aimed at actively reshaping the industry. It goes beyond just symbolism.
Any potentially deceptive wording based purely on the text?
The main thing is the implied certainty of outcomes. The EO lays out actions intended to lead to energy dominance, independence, lots of jobs, secure supply chains. But it presents these as almost inevitable results of the orders. Whether they actually happen depends on many factors outside the EO itself: market reactions, technological success, private investment choices, public acceptance, legal challenges. Claiming these outcomes will happen just because the order directs actions is potentially overstating the case.
And constitutionality.
It cites presidential authority and laws like the DPA. Directing agencies and using powers like the DPA for stated national security goals is generally within bounds. The big legal questions might revolve around that surplus plutonium policy. How does using it as fuel square with existing nuclear waste laws? The EO anticipates this, though, by directing a report on needed legislative changes. Okay, so if we put all 4 nuclear EOs together, What we see is this really concerted, aggressive strategy to massively and rapidly expand U.S. nuclear energy.
Yeah, it hits it from every angle.
Right. It tries to reshape the regulatory landscape with the NRC Reform EO. It provides huge federal support and resources via the industrial base EO. It aims to speed up the testing phase with the DOE testing EO, and it wraps it all in a national security justification with the deployment EO.
And the stated goals are always national security, energy independence, economic dominance.
Exactly. Powering AI comes up a lot too. But the potential impacts on you, the listener, are really complex. There's the promise of jobs, maybe better energy reliability down the road. But there are serious questions about safety standards, given the push for speed, environmental concerns around waste and plutonium, the transparency of some of these expedited processes, and the fact that this is a massive government intervention heavily favoring one specific industry.
That's a lot to digest on the nuclear front. Let's shift now to a very different but equally fundamental area, science policy itself. We have the executive order restoring gold standard science, also from May 23rd.
Right. This EO basically tries to redefine the rules for how the entire federal government conducts, uses, and talks about science. It starts by saying public confidence in scientists has fallen, citing things like a reproducibility crisis and data falsification. And then it claims the federal government has contributed to this loss of trust.
How so? They're using science in a misleading way.
That's the claim. It says the government used or promoted scientific info in a highly misleading manner. It gives some very specific, very pointed examples to back this up.
Like what?
Well, first, it points to the prior administration's CDC guidance on COVID-19 in schools. The EO claims this guidance incorporated edits from a teachers' union, discouraged in-person learning, and led to negative educational outcomes. And it makes the counterclaim that the best available scientific evidence at the time showed kids were unlikely to transmit or get seriously ill, and that schools could have opened safely with mitigation. So it weighs right into that huge, contentious debate.
Okay, that's a big one. What else does it cite?
It mentions NOAA fisheries, allegedly using what the EO calls an admitted worst-case scenario projection for North Atlantic right whales, a projection NOAA supposedly believed was very likely wrong. The EO claims this could have destroyed the historic Maine lobster fishery, and notes a court overturned it. The framing is that the agency deliberately used a bad worst-case scenario.
And climate change modeling.
Yes, it criticizes agencies for using RCP 8.5, which it describes as a climate change worst-case scenario based on highly unlikely assumptions, like massive future coal use. It says using this model to assess warming effects is misleading and that scientists have warned against it.
So it uses these controversial examples from public health, environment, climate science, and it links past policies to politics, too.
It does. The EO claims the prior administration further politicized science by encouraging DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations in science planning and communication. It then asserts that scientific integrity is critical for public trust.
So given all that criticism, what does this EO promise to do? What's the commitment?
The stated commitment is to restore a gold standard for science. It defines this standard with a long list of attributes: transparent, rigorous, impactful, credible, reliable, impartial evidence, reproducible, communicates error and uncertainty, collaborative, skeptical, falsifiable, unbiased peer review, rigorous, no conflicts of interest.
That sounds like a definition of ideal science.
It is. It also defines weight of scientific evidence as a careful approach, considering study quality, relevance, design, replicability, peer review, transparency, data reliability. And it explicitly commits to restoring the scientific integrity policies from the first administration of the president issuing this EO.
Okay, so how does it tell agencies to actually implement this gold standard science? What are the actions?
Within 30 days, the head of OSTP, Office of Science and Technology Policy, working with agency heads, has to issue guidance on how agencies should implement this gold standard science. Then, agency heads must quickly update their own policies, including their scientific integrity policies, based on this guidance, consulting with OMB and OSTP. And they need to report back to OSTP within 60 days of the guidance being published on what they've done.
So a new government-wide framework for science is coming soon. Are there immediate rules that kick in even before that?
Yes. Starting 30 days after the EO date, agencies and their employees have to follow specific rules. Rule 1. No scientific misconduct, fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, and don't knowingly rely on info resulting from misconduct. Rule 2 is about transparency. Making data public. Yes. They must make publicly available with exceptions for things like national security, privacy, legal restrictions, or enforcement risk models, what the EO calls influential scientific info. That means the data, analyses, conclusions that could have a clear substantial effect on important public or private policy decisions, and critically, they also have to release the models used to generate that info.
Releasing the models themselves, that seems significant.
It is. And the EO explicitly says agencies cannot use FOIA Exemption 5, the deliberative process privilege, to hide these models unless the agency head personally authorizes it and notifies OSTP. Other rules. Agencies must transparently document uncertainties, including how uncertainty travels through their models. When using science for decisions, they have to evaluate realistic or reasonably foreseeable effects, not just worst-case scenarios. They must be transparent about the likelihood of assumptions and scenarios used, and those highly unlikely and overly precautionary assumption scenarios. They should only be used if absolutely required by law or clearly pertinent. They have to use that weight of scientific evidence approach. And their communications must match the analysis results, clearly state uncertainty, and reference key assumptions if models were used.
Okay, that rule about avoiding highly unlikely scenarios directly links back to the criticism of RCP 8.5 climate modeling, and this EO explicitly targets policies from the previous administration.
Very directly. It says that until agencies issue their new policies based on this EO, their old scientific integrity policies apply, unless they conflict with this EO, in which case this EO overrides them. Agency heads are ordered to reevaluate, revise, or get rid of policies, procedures, and amendments issued between January 20, 2021 and January 20, 2025.
The entire period of the previous administration.
Exactly. They must also revoke organizational changes and documents issued under the January 27, 2021 memo about restoring trust in government, basically reverting the structure back to how it was before that memo. And agencies have to review all actions taken during that period, regulations, guidance, policies, evaluations, and take steps to make sure they align with this new EO's requirements.
Wow, that's a clear directive to potentially undo a lot of the prior administration's science-related work based on this new framework. How is compliance enforced?
Each agency head has to set up internal processes for oversight and enforcement, led by a senior appointee, meaning a political appointee, or non-career SES member. These internal processes have to include ways to correct information errors under the Information Quality Act, and they can refer violations for discipline. And the EO states these internal processes are the only way to address alleged violations of this EO or the resulting policies, unless another law specifically requires a different process.
Is there a way out? A waiver?
Yes, an agency head can ask the OMB director for a waiver if OSTP agrees, for good cause, as long as they explain how it's still consistent with the EO's overall policy. And crucially, the EO explicitly says its policies apply to foreign affairs, military, national security, and homeland security only to the extent determined by the agency head in their sole discretion. That creates potentially huge exceptions.
Okay, let's try to sum up the potential effects on you, the listener, from this science EO. This seems like it could have really broad impacts.
It could. Definitely, because it aims to change the scientific foundation for regulations and policies across so many areas. That mandated shift away from using highly unlikely and overly precautionary assumptions and potentially reconsidering models like LNT for radiation, as seen in the NRCEO, which ties into this, that could lead to less stringent regulations for things involving low probability but high impact risks, or risks from low exposure levels.
Less stringent environmental rules, maybe,
Yep.
or safety standards.
Potentially, yes. On the other hand, the requirement for more data and model transparency could be good for public understanding and allow outside experts to better scrutinize agency science. But the directive to revisit and possibly roll back policies from the prior administration could mean significant changes in how agencies assess risks in areas like environmental protection or public health. So the impact is potentially wide-ranging, affecting your safety, the environment, public health advice, and even your trust in government science, depending on how this gold standard is actually implemented.
Who stands to benefit from these changes? Any specific groups or industries?
Well, industries that are heavily regulated based on scientific assessments, think environmental rules, chemical safety, emissions limits, could potentially benefit if regulations become less strict. If the science policy shifts away from precautionary approaches or uses different risk models, that could lead to lighter regulation. Increased transparency might also help businesses challenge the scientific basis of rules they don't like. The EO itself frames this partly in terms of spurring innovation in the economy, suggesting potential benefits for sectors affected by science-based rules if those rules change.
How much symbolism or political theater is in this one?
This EO feels intensely political. It uses very strong language to criticize the prior administration's handling of science, bringing up hot-button issues like COVID schools, climate models, and specific environmental disputes. Calling its own approach the gold standard presents it as the obviously correct way, and explicitly ordering agencies to reevaluate and revert policies from the previous 4 years.
Hmm.
That makes the political motivation crystal clear. It's using science policy as a major arena to contest the actions and philosophy of the preceding administration.
Okay, and based just on the text, are there potentially deceptive elements here?
Well, the EO makes very specific claims about the alleged misuse of science by the prior administration, the COVID guidance, the NOAA whale projection. It presents its interpretation of these events as factual justification for its new policies. But whether the science at the time definitively contradicted the COVID guidance or whether NOAA's model use was truly inappropriate by standard practices, those are complex, debatable points. The EO presents one side as settled fact to support its case, similarly stating that models like Ellen-Taylor lack sound scientific basis. That's a scientifically contested view, not a universal truth, yet the EO uses it to justify potentially changing safety standards. The definition of gold standard science itself, while sounding objective, reflects a specific philosophical approach to risk and evidence. The EO uses these claims and definitions to justify a major policy shift.
And constitutionality. Any potential issues based on the text?
It cites the president's authority over executive branch employees and agencies. Directing internal processes for using information is generally within that power, but telling agencies to revisit and potentially undo specific actions from a prior administration, especially if those actions were based on statutory requirements, like environmental laws or safety acts, or the NRC's safety mission, that could potentially lead to legal challenges about conflicting mandates or overreach. And that carve-out giving agency heads sole discretion on applying this to national security also raises questions about consistency and limits. So bottom line, the Science EO is a highly political directive aiming to fundamentally change how federal agencies approach and use science. It criticizes past practices, mandates a new framework emphasizing realism over precaution and increased transparency, and explicitly targets the prior administration's work. It could have sweeping effects on regulations affecting health, safety, and the environment, while raising deep questions about how science, risk, and policy interact.
Okay, one more executive order to cover, and this one could have a very direct impact on people's wallets and health. Prescription drug pricing. This is the executive order delivering most favored nation prescription drug pricing to American patients, dated May 12, 2025.
Right. This EO dives straight into the high cost of prescription drugs in the U.S., and it frames the problem almost entirely as an issue of global unfairness. It kicks off by claiming the U.S. funds about 3/4 of global pharmaceutical profits, despite having less than 5% of the world's population. It calls U.S. prices enormously high, while manufacturers give big discounts overseas.
It uses some really strong language here. Egregious imbalance. Americans unwittingly sponsor drug companies in other countries.
Yeah, it argues that high U.S. prices are what fuel global innovation while foreign health systems get a free ride. It calls this abuse and says it must end. Americans, it declares, shouldn't subsidize low foreign costs while overpaying at home. And it states Americans should get the best deal because the U.S. is the biggest buyer.
So what's the core policy it's pushing for?
The policy is stated very clearly. Americans shouldn't subsidize other countries, and they should get access to the most favored nation price, or MFN price, for prescription drugs and biologics.
MFN, that usually means the lowest price a seller offers to any comparable buyer, right?
Exactly. Here it means the lowest price the drug manufacturer charges in a comparable developed country. The EO says the administration will take immediate steps and warns of additional aggressive action if drug makers don't start offering that MFN price in the U.S.
Okay, so what are these immediate steps? What actions does it actually order?
It outlines several things. First, it tells the Secretaries of Commerce and the USTR to take action to make sure foreign countries aren't forcing Americans to overpay for R&D by keeping foreign prices unfairly low. Section 3. Second, it directs the Secretary of Health and Human Services, HHS, to the extent consistent with law, to facilitate direct-to-consumer purchasing programs.
Meaning programs where manufacturers could sell directly to patients.
Yes, specifically manufacturers willing to sell directly to American patients at the MFN price. Third, and this seems key for putting pressure on companies, within 30 days, the HHS Secretary, working with the Domestic Policy Advisor and the head of CMS, has to communicate MFN price targets to drug manufacturers, aiming to bring U.S. prices down to levels in comparably developed nations.
So tell the companies what the target low price is. What happens if they don't meet those targets, if there isn't significant progress?
That's where the threatened additional aggressive action comes in, again consistent with law. The EO says if significant progress isn't delivered after those targets are communicated, then two main things shall happen. First, the HHS Secretary shall propose a rulemaking plan to actually impose MFN pricing directly through regulation.
So move from targets to potentially mandatory price controls via rulemaking.
That's the implication. Second, the HHS Secretary shall consider certification to Congress that allowing drug importation under a specific part of the law, FTCA Section 804J, wouldn't add risk and would save significant money. If HHS certifies that, then the FDA Commissioner shall take action under that law to outline how they could consistently grant waivers for importing drugs on a case-by-case basis from developed countries where they're cheaper.
So if companies don't lower prices voluntarily, the administration will look at proposing price regulations and facilitating drug importation from cheaper countries.
Exactly. There are other potential follow-on actions, too. Based on a prior EO report, the Attorney General and FTC Chair shall take enforcement action against anti-competitive practices in the drug industry using antitrust laws, again, consistent with law. The Commerce Secretary and others are told to review drug exports that might be enabling price discrimination. And the FDA Commissioner is directed to review and possibly revoke approvals for drugs that maybe be unsafe, ineffective, or improperly marketed.
Wait, revoking drug approvals if prices don't come down? That seems like a different issue.
It does seem somewhat separate from pricing, linking safety efficacy review to lack of progress on MFN pricing. It's listed under the "if significant progress isn't delivered" section. Finally, all agency heads are told to take all action available to deal with this perceived global freeloading and price discrimination.
Okay, let's talk effects. What's the potential impact on you, the regular American, from this drug pricing EO?
Well, the stated goal is crystal clear and highly relevant. Lower your prescription drug costs. If this policy actually works as intended, it would be a huge deal for healthcare affordability and access. Getting needed medicines could become easier, out-of-pocket costs could drop significantly.
But the EO doesn't guarantee lower prices immediately, right?
No, it outlines steps. Communicating targets, proposing rulemaking if targets aren't met, considering importation certification. These are mechanisms aimed at achieving the goal. But success depends on manufacturers actually lowering prices in response to the targets, or on those follow-up actions, the rulemaking, the importation waivers being implemented effectively, and surviving legal challenges. So the ultimate impact on the price you pay is uncertain based just on this EO. But the intent is absolutely focused on lowering your healthcare costs.
How about businesses, especially the pharmaceutical industry? What's the likely impact on them?
For the pharmaceutical industry, this looks potentially very negative for their bottom line. If they were forced to lower U.S. prices to match the lowest prices in other developed countries, that would likely hit their profits hard. The EO itself claims most of their global profits come from the U.S. market. Lower prices could affect how much they invest in R&D, change their business models, impact their stock prices.
So it's definitely not aimed at benefiting them.
No, it's aimed at lowering costs for patients and payers. The only potential benefit mentioned is facilitating those direct-to-consumer sales, Section 4, but that's framed as a way for patients to get the MFN price if manufacturers choose to offer it, not necessarily as a boon for the companies themselves unless they opt in at lower prices. Antitrust enforcement could also disrupt their current practices.
How much symbolism or political theater is at play here?
There's a lot of strong populist language. Americans first, global freeloading, abuse of Americans' generosity, getting the best deal. Using the term most favored nation, which comes from trade deals, and applying it to drug prices has a powerful rhetorical effect. The explicit threat of additional aggressive action if companies don't comply serves a clear political purpose. Pressure the industry and show voters the administration is fighting high drug costs, which is always a popular issue. The whole narrative about foreign countries getting a free ride is a key political argument underpinning this approach.
Are there potentially deceptive elements in the wording based just on the text?
Well, ECO makes very strong statements like, Americans will no longer be forced to pay almost 3 times more, and Americans should get the best deal. These sound like accomplished facts or guarantees. But the actual text mostly mandates steps toward that goal, communicating targets, proposing rules later, considering importation. It doesn't, and perhaps legally can't, guarantee that manufacturers will comply or that the follow-up actions will successfully force all prices down to the MFN level for everyone. The direct-to-consumer idea is limited by, to the extent consistent with law, adding more uncertainty. And the claim that high U.S. prices solely fuel global innovation while others get a free ride is a very strong, possibly oversimplified take on complex global pharma economics. So it presents a desired outcome as a certainty, while the mechanisms described are contingent and face hurdles.
And potential constitutionality issues.
It cites the president's authority in laws, directing agencies like HHS, FDA, FTC to pursue policies and consider actions like rulemaking or importation certification is generally okay, especially where laws like the FDCA already provide a framework like Section 804J for importation, which has strict conditions. But any attempt to impose broad price controls via executive rulemaking rather than specific congressional action could face major legal challenges. Does HHS truly have the statutory authority to mandate MFN pricing across the board? That's questionable and would likely be litigated, especially regarding potential conflicts with existing laws like Medicare's rules. The repeated phrase, "to the extent consistent with law," throughout the EO basically acknowledges these legal constraints and potential fights ahead. So the drug pricing EO represents a direct assault on high drug costs, using the politically potent frame of global unfairness and demanding the best deal for Americans. It sets up a process involving targets and threats of stronger action, like regulation and importation. It clearly aims to help your wallet, but faces significant legal and practical hurdles to actually deliver universal MFN pricing.
Wow, okay, that covers the whole stack. We have gone from recognizing heritage and service to creating a new online safety law to shaking up trade with China, launching a massive push for nuclear power with major regulatory changes, redefining government science policy, and tackling prescription drug prices. That's quite a range.
It really is. It shows the breadth of issues addressed through these different presidential actions and legislation. Maybe we should take a moment to pull together some threads thinking about those initial questions we had.
Good idea. Based purely on the text we've reviewed, which of these actions seem most likely to have a real, concrete effect on regular Americans, going beyond just symbolism?
Well, the Take It Down Act, being a law, has very direct effects on online safety and provides legal recourse. That's concrete. The drug pricing EO, if its mechanisms are successful, aims directly at your healthcare costs, which is very concrete, though the outcome is uncertain. The temporary tariffs EO could have a small temporary effect on the prices of some goods you buy.
And the others? Nuclear science.
The nuclear EOs collectively could have concrete effects down the line on jobs in that sector, maybe long-term energy costs or reliability, but also, crucially, on safety and environmental standards because of the push for speed and regulatory changes. The science EOs is potentially very concrete in its effects because it aims to change the scientific basis for regulations that affect public health, safety, and the environment we all live in. Its impact might be less immediate, but potentially very broad.
Okay. Were there actions that seemed primarily designed to benefit wealthy individuals or specific businesses?
The nuclear EOs definitely stand out there. They offer a huge package of federal support funding, resources, fuel, sites, combined with significant deregulation and streamlining. That's a massive potential benefit directed squarely at the nuclear industry, from fuel suppliers to reactor builders and operators. The tariffs EO also provided that temporary cost relief specifically to businesses importing from China.
Which actions felt like they had strong elements of symbolism or political theater?
The proclamations by nature are mostly symbolic, though we saw how some were used to send strong political messages, like the Jewish American Heritage Month, one addressing anti-Semitism and campus issues, or the Maritime Day 1, boosting a recent industry-focused EO. Many of the executive orders also deployed significant political rhetoric, energy dominance, American superiority, fighting global freeloading, criticizing the prior administration, setting ambitious targets like 400 gigaBU of nuclear by 2050 or hitting criticality by July 4, 2026 also serves a political purpose alongside the technical one.
We also talked about potentially deceptive wording based just on the text. Can you quickly recap where we saw that?
Yeah, mainly in how desired outcomes were sometimes presented as certainties. The drug pricing EO is saying Americans will no longer be forced to pay when it outlines contingent steps. The nuclear EOs and science EOs making strong claims about the scientific basis for policies like challenging Ellen Talara as lacking sound scientific basis, which are scientifically contested but used to justify major shifts, or using specific legal interpretations like classifying advanced reactor testing as research in the DOE testing EO, which facilitates a different regulatory path but might be debatable. It's about how the justification's framed versus the actual mechanisms and uncertainties.
And finally, connecting back to broader values like healthcare, education, or dignity for all, how did these actions touch on those?
The drug pricing EO is obviously aimed right at healthcare costs and access. The science EO impacts the foundation for policies affecting public health and environmental safety, which relate to well-being and dignity. The Take 8 Down Act directly addresses online dignity and safety. The proclamations about heritage and armed forces are about recognizing the dignity of specific groups and professions. The nuclear EOs touch on energy infrastructure relevant to all sectors. Their workforce focus impacts education. But the potential trade-offs on safety and environment also relate fundamentally to well-being and dignity. So it's clear these documents, whether laws, orders, or proclamations, represent significant attempts to wield government power, shift policies, allocate resources, change regulations, and potentially influence the economy and society in ways that could ripple out and affect your life.
And it's crucial to remember, as we've said, the full impact isn't guaranteed by these documents alone. It really depends on how agencies implement them, how markets react if they face legal challenges. We've just analyzed the potential impacts and the stated intent based strictly on the text we have.
Exactly. These papers lay out the plan, the priorities, the directives, but the real world is always more complicated, and the consequences unfold over time.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with. Think about how these actions are justified. They often use broad appeals, national security, economic dominance, fairness, scientific integrity. These are things most people would agree are important.
Right, the justifications are designed to resonate widely.
But then look at the specific mechanisms chosen. Aggressive timelines, fundamental changes to regulations or the science behind them, big support packages for specific industries, using specific legal interpretations to maybe change pathways. These mechanisms might end up having very different effects on different groups of people, even if the stated goal sounds universal.
That disparity between broad goals and specific impacts is key.
So what does it mean for us when major policy shifts on things as vital as safety, health, the environment, the economy, get launched through executive actions like these, sometimes pushing for extreme speed, sometimes changing long-standing processes, all based on the interpretations and priorities presented in these initial documents? It really makes you think about how government power works, who benefits, who might bear the risks, and what questions we should be asking as these plans move forward.
Absolutely. Always important to look beyond the stated goals and analyze the actual mechanics and potential consequences laid out in the text itself.